The sky blackened with the fury of an approaching storm as Margaret Thornton struggled against her bindings, the rough rope digging into her wrists and the unyielding oak at her back offering no comfort. Her captors had disappeared into the darkening horizon half an hour earlier, leaving her to the mercy of whatever wild animals or elements might claim her first. Margaret had never imagined her journey to visit her cousin in Santa Fe would end with her stagecoach ambushed, her meager possessions stolen, and her very life hanging in the balance. The year 1875 had started with such promise, a new beginning away from the stifling confines of Boston society. Now, as thunder rolled across the vast New Mexico territory, she wondered if she would live to see another sunrise. The first heavy raindrops began to fall, splattering against her cheeks and mixing with tears she could no longer hold back. The expensive blue traveling dress that had drawn admiring glances in Boston was now torn and mudded, her carefully pinned auburn hair falling in wet tendrils around her face. "Help!" she called out, her voice barely audible above the strengthening wind. "Please, is anyone there?" Only the howl of the storm answered her pleas. Margaret closed her eyes, attempting to summon the courage her father had always praised her for. Richard Thornton had raised his daughter to be resilient after her mother's death, but nothing in her 23 years had prepared her for this. The bandits who'd taken her from the stagecoach had debated killing her before deciding she might fetch a ransom if left where someone might find her. Or perhaps they merely wanted to prolong her suffering. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the barren landscape around her. In that brief flash, Margaret caught sight of movement on the horizon, a silhouette that hadn't been there before. Fear and hope warred within her chest. Was it the bandits returning, a wild animal drawn by her distress? Or could it be salvation, over here? She screamed, straining against her bonds until the rope cut deeper into her skin. The rain came down harder now, a punishing deluge that reduced visibility to mere feet. Margaret lost sight of whatever she'd glimpsed in the lightning flash. Despair threatened to overwhelm her as the minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity as the storm raged around her. Then she heard it, the rhythmic pounding of hooves, steadily approaching despite the storm. Margaret lifted her head, blinking away the rain from her lashes as she strained to see through the curtain of water. A massive black horse emerged from the gloom, its rider hunched against the storm's fury. The man pulled his mount to a halt several yards from her, straightening in his saddle as lightning illuminated them both. Margaret caught a glimpse of a weathered face beneath the brim of a worn cowboy hat before darkness fell again. "Sweet mercy," a deep voice called out. "What devil's work is this, please?" Margaret called back, her voice breaking. "Help me." The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, securing his horse before approaching her. As he drew closer, Margaret could make out more of his features, a strong jaw darkened with several days' stubble, intense eyes that assessed her situation quickly, and broad shoulders that spoke of a life of physical labor. "Hold still, madam," he instructed, drawing a knife from his belt. Margaret tensed instinctively at the sight of the blade, but the stranger moved with careful precision, cutting through her bonds with several quick sawing motions. The moment the ropes gave way, her legs buckled beneath her. The cowboy caught her before she could collapse into the mud, one arm sliding around her waist to steady her. "I've got you," he assured her, his voice gentler now. "Can you stand?" "I think so," Margaret replied, though her limbs felt like water after hours of restricted circulation. "Thank you. I thought I might die out here." "Not while I'm around," the man said with quiet determination. "Name's Thomas Grayson. Most folks call me Tom." "Margaret Thornton," she managed through chattering teeth. "The stagecoach to Santa Fe. Bandits attacked. They took everything." Thomas nodded grimly. "We need to get you someplace dry. My cabin's about an hour's ride from here. Think you can make it that far?" Margaret glanced at his powerful horse, now stamping impatiently in the downpour. "I've never ridden astride before, Mr. Grayson." A hint of amusement flickered across his face. "First time for everything, Miss Thornton. And out here, it's just Tom." With surprising gentleness, he helped her to the horse and lifted her into the saddle before mounting behind her. One strong arm wrapped around her waist to keep her secure as he took the reins in his other hand. Margaret found herself pressed against the solid warmth of his chest, a stark contrast to the cold rain still pelting them both. "Hold tight," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear. "Thunder's a good horse, but this storm's got him spooked." Margaret nodded, too exhausted and grateful to worry about propriety. As the horse began moving through the storm, she found herself leaning back against Thomas Grayson's chest, drawing strength from his steady presence. The journey to Thomas's cabin passed in a blur of rain and wind. Margaret drifted in and out of awareness, the trauma of the day and the rhythmic motion of the horse conspiring to drain what remained of her energy. She was vaguely aware of Thomas speaking to her occasionally, his deep voice rumbling through his chest against her back, but she couldn't summon the strength to respond. When they finally arrived at a small log cabin nestled against a rocky hillside, Margaret was barely conscious. Thomas dismounted first, then gently lifted her from the saddle. She tried to stand but found her legs wouldn't cooperate. "Easy now," Thomas murmured, scooping her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Let's get you inside." The cabin was simple but sturdy, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. Thomas set her down carefully on a chair near the cold hearth. "Stay put," he instructed. "I need to see to Thunder, then I'll get a fire going." Margaret nodded weakly, watching as he disappeared back into the storm. True to his word, he returned minutes later, water streaming from his hat and coat. Without ceremony, he shed his drenched outer garments and set about building a fire with practiced efficiency. Soon, the comforting crackle of flames filled the small space and blessed warmth began to chase away the bone-deep chill. "You're shivering something fierce," Thomas observed, concern evident in his voice. "There's dry clothing in that trunk by the bed. Nothing fancy, but they'll be warm." Margaret glanced at the wooden trunk he indicated, then back at him. I cannot simply undress with you present, Mr. Grayson." A flush crept up his tan neck. "Of course. My apologies, Miss Thornton. I'll step outside while you change." "But the storm, I've weathered worse," he said with a slight smile. "Call out when you're decent." True to his word, Thomas stepped back into the downpour, leaving Margaret alone in the cabin. Moving stiffly, she crossed to the trunk and found several clean shirts and a pair of trousers that would clearly swallow her whole. With trembling fingers, she managed to undo the sodden buttons of her ruined dress and peel off the layers of wet clothing. The simple act of changing exhausted what little strength she had left, but the dry clothing, a shirt that hung past her knees and pants she had to roll up several times, offered immediate relief. "Mr. Grayson," she called out when she was finished, "you may come in now." The door opened immediately, suggesting he'd been waiting just outside. Thomas entered, water dripping from his hat brim, his expression softening when he saw her swimming in his clothes. "You look like a child playing dress-up," he remarked, a hint of amusement in his eyes. Margaret smoothed down the oversized shirt self-consciously. "I must look ridiculous." "No," he countered, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "You look alive, which is what matters. Come closer to the fire. I'll make some coffee to warm you up proper." As Thomas busied himself with the coffee, Margaret took the opportunity to study her rescuer more carefully. He moved with the fluid grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, his actions economical and precise. Though his cabin was spare, it was clean and orderly. Not the dwelling of a drifter, but of a man who had made a home for himself in this wild country. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, wrapping her arms around herself as she sat near the fire. Thomas glanced up from measuring coffee grounds. "Going on 5 years now." "Came west after the war, looking for something different." "The war? You fought for the Union," he nodded. "Pennsylvania 83rd. Saw more than my share of bloodshed before Appomattox." His expression clouded briefly. "Found I couldn't settle back into city life afterward. Too many ghosts." Margaret understood all too well. Her own father had returned from the war a changed man, his laughter less frequent, his eyes holding shadows that hadn't been there before. "My father served as well. He said the land out west had a way of healing broken spirits." Thomas's expression softened slightly. "Your father was a wise man. There's something about this country, harsh as it can be, that lets a person breathe again." He poured steaming coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to Margaret. "What brought you out this way, Miss Thornton?" "Most Boston ladies I've encountered wouldn't venture past St. Louis." Margaret wrapped her fingers around the warm cup gratefully. "My cousin Emily married a man who owns a mercantile in Santa Fe. After my father passed last winter, there was little reason to remain in Boston." She didn't mention how quickly the vultures had descended. After Richard Thornton's funeral, the so-called friends who'd expected her to marry quickly to secure her position. The suitors more interested in her modest inheritance than her companionship. The letter from Emily, offering her a fresh start, had been a lifeline she'd grasped eagerly. "I'm sorry about your father," Thomas said quietly. "It's not easy losing the people who anchor us to this world." The simple sincerity in his voice brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. She blinked them back, taking a sip of the strong coffee instead. "No, it isn't, but I'm determined to make my own way now." "Starting with getting robbed and tied to a tree," Thomas observed dryly. "Not the most auspicious beginning to your Western adventure." Despite everything, Margaret found herself laughing, a small, fragile sound that nonetheless eased some of the tension from her shoulders. "No, I suppose not. My father always said I had a talent for finding trouble." Thomas's lips quirked upward. "Well, Miss Thornton, I have a feeling you'll find plenty of that out here. The question is whether you've got the spine to face it down." "I was raised to believe a Thornton never backs down from a challenge, Mr. Grayson," she replied with more spirit than she felt. His eyes, which she now saw were a deep blue-gray like the sky before a storm, assessed her with new respect. "Then I reckon you might just do fine in this territory after all." As the storm continued to rage outside, Thomas prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and biscuits. Margaret insisted on helping despite her exhaustion, and soon they were seated at his small table sharing the first real food she'd had since morning. "Tomorrow, once the storm passes, I'll take you to Santa Fe," Thomas said as they ate. "It's a 2-day ride from here, but your cousin will be worried when the stage doesn't arrive." Margaret nodded, grateful for his kindness but suddenly aware of how dependent she was on this stranger. "You've already done so much, Mr. Grayson. I couldn't possibly impose further." "It's no imposition," he replied firmly. "I won't have it said that Thomas Grayson rescued a lady only to abandon her afterward." "You have a reputation to protect?" Margaret asked, a small smile playing at her lips. Thomas returned her smile with one of his own, transforming his weathered features. "What little I have. Most folks around these parts know me as a man who keeps to himself. I trap in the mountains during winter, do odd jobs when needed, and generally mind my own business." A solitary existence, Margaret observed. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, a brief glimpse of loneliness quickly masked. It suits me. Margaret wasn't certain she believed him, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her, making it difficult to maintain conversation. Thomas noticed her struggling to keep her eyes open and stood from the table. "You take the bed," he said, gesturing to the narrow cot against the far wall. "I'll sleep by the fire." Too tired to argue, Margaret nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson, for everything." "Tom," he reminded her gently, "out here formality just wastes breath." "Tom," she repeated, finding she liked the simple sound of it. "Then you must call me Margaret," he nodded once, a strangely solemn gesture. "Sleep well, Margaret, you're safe now." As she settled onto the surprisingly comfortable bed, Margaret realized she believed him completely. Despite the ordeal she'd endured, despite being in a strange man's cabin miles from civilization, she felt safer than she had in months. The steady rhythm of the rain on the roof and Thomas moving quietly around the cabin lulled her into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning brought clear skies and the earthy scent of the desert after rain. Margaret woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until memories of the previous day came flooding back. She sat up cautiously, wincing at the soreness in her wrists and shoulders from her hours tied to the tree. Thomas was already awake, tending to something at the stove. He turned at the sound of her movement, offering a nod of greeting. "Good morning," he said. "How are you feeling?" Margaret pushed a strand of hair from her face, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. "Sore, but alive thanks to you. Thought you might be hurting." He gestured to a small pot on the stove. "Made a salve that should help with those rope burns. And there's fresh water in that basin if you want to wash up." Margaret felt a rush of gratitude at his thoughtfulness. "Thank you." While Thomas stepped outside to give her privacy, Margaret used the cold water to wash her face and attempt to bring some order to her tangled hair. Without a proper brush or pins, the best she could manage was a simple braid. Her own clothing was still damp, so she remained in Thomas's oversized garments, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs as best she could. When Thomas returned, he carried a small bundle. "Found these in my trunk. Belonged to my sister before she married and moved to Oregon. They might fit you better than my things." The bundle contained a simple brown skirt and white blouse, plain but clean. "Your sister won't mind. Sarah left them here years ago. Said I should keep them in case I found myself a wife." His ears reddened slightly at his own words. "Not that I just meant they're of no use to me." Margaret accepted the clothing with a smile, charmed by his discomfort. "Please thank your sister for me when you next write to her." After changing into Sarah Grayson's clothing, which fit reasonably well despite being a bit loose at the waist, Margaret felt more like herself. Thomas had prepared a breakfast of cornmeal mush with molasses, simple fare but filling. As they ate, he outlined their journey. "We'll ride as far as Jenkins Creek today," he explained. "There's a roadhouse there where we can spend the night. Should reach Santa Fe by sundown tomorrow if the weather holds." Margaret nodded, trying not to think about spending hours pressed against him on horseback again. Despite the propriety she'd been raised with, she couldn't deny a certain awareness of Thomas Grayson as a man, one who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. "I have no money to pay for lodging," she admitted reluctantly. "The bandits took everything." Thomas waved away her concern. "I've got enough to see us through. Your cousin can settle accounts when we reach Santa Fe if it troubles you." After breakfast, Thomas saddled Thunder while Margaret gathered the few belongings she now possessed, her damp traveling dress and undergarments, which Thomas had hung near the fire overnight. Everything else, her trunk, her father's pocket watch, her mother's cameo, was lost to the bandits. "Ready." Thomas asked when she emerged from the cabin. Margaret squared her shoulders. As I'll ever be. The day was clear and beautiful, the storm having washed the landscape clean. As they rode, Margaret found herself enchanted by the rugged beauty of the New Mexico territory. Vast expanses of red earth were punctuated by dramatic mesas and distant mountains, the sky an impossible blue overhead. Thomas proved to be a knowledgeable guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the land they passed through. Though still reserved, he seemed more at ease in the open countryside, occasionally revealing flashes of dry humor that made Margaret laugh despite her circumstances. "How did you come to be on that particular stretch of road yesterday?" she asked as they stopped to rest thunder near a small stream. "It seems providential that you found me." Thomas handed her a canteen of water before answering. "I was returning from delivering furs to a trading post about 20 miles east. Normally, I'd have waited out the storm, but something told me to push on." He shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "My mother would have called it divine intervention. I just call it lucky timing." "For me, certainly," Margaret agreed. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't come along." Thomas's expression darkened. "Best not to dwell on it. You're safe now, and that's what matters." As they continued their journey, Margaret found herself studying the strong line of Thomas's back, the confident way he handled his horse, the gentleness in his hands despite their callous strength. He was unlike any man she'd known in Boston, straightforward in his speech, unbound by social niceties, yet possessing a natural courtesy that put her at ease. By mid-afternoon, they had covered considerable distance. Margaret's muscles protested the unaccustomed activity, but she refused to complain. When Thomas suggested they rest in the shade of a large rock formation, she gratefully dismounted, trying to hide her discomfort as her feet touched the ground. "You're doing well for someone who's never ridden astride before," Thomas observed, helping her to a flat rock where she could sit. "I'm trying not to embarrass myself," Margaret admitted with a small smile, "though I suspect I'll be unable to walk tomorrow." Thomas chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "First time I rode 2 days straight, I couldn't get out of bed the next morning. My father had no sympathy, said it was the price of learning." "Your father sounds similar to mine," Margaret said. "He believed in learning through experience, even when it involved discomfort. Wise man. Out here, book learning only takes you so far. It's experience that keeps you alive." Thomas passed her some jerky and dried fruit from his saddlebag. "Eat something. We've still got a few hours before we reach the roadhouse." As they shared the simple meal, Margaret found herself wanting to know more about this quiet, capable man who had saved her life. "Have you always lived in the West?" Thomas shook his head. "Grew up in Pennsylvania. My father had a small farm outside Pittsburgh. After the war, I drifted west, tried my hand at mining in Colorado, ranching in Wyoming. Nothing seemed to fit until I found this territory. And now, what keeps you here?" He was silent for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the vast landscape. "Space to breathe, freedom to live by my own rules, and the land itself, it gets under your skin after a while." "I think I understand," Margaret said softly. "Even in the short time I've been here, there's something powerful about this place." Thomas looked at her with renewed interest. "Most Easterners just see the hardship, the heat, the dust, the danger. They miss the beauty." "Perhaps they're not looking properly," Margaret suggested. "My father always said beauty reveals itself to those willing to see beyond the surface." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a warming in his eyes that made Margaret's heart beat faster. "Your father sounds like a man I would have respected, Margaret Thornton." The way he said her full name sent an unexpected shiver through her. "I believe he would have liked you as well, Thomas Grayson." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities, until Thomas cleared his throat and stood. "We should keep moving if we want to reach Jenkins Creek before dark." The remainder of the day's journey passed in comfortable conversation, as Margaret gradually learned more about Thomas's life. He spoke of his time in the war with reluctance, but shared amusing stories about his early attempts at trapping and his encounters with the various characters who populated the territory. In turn, Margaret told him about her life in Boston, her father's shipping business, her mother's early death, her own struggles to find purpose in the restrictive social circles she'd inhabited. She found herself confiding things she'd never shared with anyone, not even her cousin Emily. "I was engaged once," she admitted as the afternoon shadows lengthened, "to the son of my father's business partner. William Hartley seemed everything a proper Boston gentleman should be: well-educated, well-connected, suitable in every way." "But," Thomas prompted when she fell silent. "But I realized he wanted an ornament, not a partner. When I expressed opinions that differed from his, he would smile indulgently as if I were a child speaking nonsense." Margaret shook her head at the memory. "After one particularly heated disagreement about whether women should have the vote, I returned his ring. My father supported my decision, but many in our social circle thought I was throwing away my best chance at security." "Their loss," Thomas said simply. "A man who can't respect a woman's mind doesn't deserve her heart." His words warmed something inside her that had been cold for too long. "That's precisely what my father said." By the time they reached Jenkins Creek, the sun was setting in a spectacular display of orange and crimson. The roadhouse was a substantial two-story building of adobe and wood, with a stable attached and several horses already hitched outside. "It's not the Palmer house," Thomas warned as he helped Margaret dismount, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. "But Mrs. Jenkins keeps clean rooms and serves decent food. After sleeping in the wilderness tied to a tree, I assure you it will seem like paradise," Margaret replied with a smile that made him chuckle. The roadhouse's common room was busy with travelers and locals, the air thick with tobacco smoke and conversation. Heads turned as they entered, curious glances assessing them before returning to their drinks and discussions. Mrs. Jenkins, a formidable woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun, greeted Thomas with evident familiarity. "Thomas Grayson, haven't seen you in these parts for months. Who's your companion?" "Margaret Thornton," Thomas introduced her. "She was on the Santa Fe stage that was robbed yesterday. I'm escorting her to her cousin's home." Mrs. Jenkins's stern expression softened with sympathy. "Heard about that stage. Terrible business. You're lucky to be alive, Miss Thornton." "Thanks to Mr. Grayson," Margaret acknowledged. "We need 2 rooms for the night," Thomas said, reaching for his money pouch. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "Only got 1 room left, I'm afraid. Stage from Albuquerque brought extra passengers after they had wheel trouble." Thomas frowned, glancing at Margaret uncertainly. "Perhaps we could continue on." "Nonsense," Mrs. Jenkins interrupted. "It's getting dark, and the road to Santa Fe isn't safe at night. The room has 2 beds. I'm sure Miss Thornton would rather share a room with you than risk bandits again." Put that way, the decision was simple. Margaret nodded her agreement, too tired to worry about impropriety. "2 beds will be fine, Mrs. Jenkins." The room was small but clean, with 2 narrow beds separated by a simple wooden table. A basin and pitcher sat atop a chest of drawers, and a faded curtain covered the single window. Despite its plainness, it felt luxurious to Margaret after her ordeal. "I'll let you get settled," Thomas said awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the arrangement despite its necessity. "Meet you downstairs for supper in half an hour." Margaret nodded gratefully, touched by his concern for her comfort and reputation. After he left, she used the water in the basin to wash away the dust of travel, then did her best to make herself presentable with her limited resources. Downstairs, the common room had grown more crowded. Thomas had secured them a small table in the corner, and a serving girl quickly brought bowls of hearty stew and thick slices of bread. The simple meal tasted better than any fancy dinner Margaret could remember in Boston. "I spoke with a man who came from Santa Fe today," Thomas said as they ate. "The bandits who robbed your stage have been causing trouble throughout the territory. The marshal has a posse tracking them." "You think they'll be caught?" Margaret asked. Thomas's expression was grim. "Eventually. Men like that get careless, especially once they've had some success. They'll make a mistake, or someone will turn them in for the reward." The reminder of how close she'd come to death dampened Margaret's spirits. Thomas seemed to sense her discomfort and deliberately changed the subject, telling her about Santa Fe and what she could expect when they arrived tomorrow. His consideration touched her deeply. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself increasingly aware of the man across from her. In the lamplight, Thomas Grayson's features seemed softer, the lines around his eyes crinkling when he smiled, his hands strong yet gentle as he broke bread. Something fundamental had shifted between them during their journey, a connection forged through shared danger and honest conversation. When they finally retired to their room, an awkward silence fell. Thomas cleared his throat. "I'll turn my back while you prepare for bed." "Thank you," Margaret murmured, quickly changing into the nightgown Mrs. Jenkins had loaned her and slipping beneath the covers of one bed. "I'm decent now." Thomas nodded and took his turn preparing for the night, removing his boots and outer clothing but keeping his shirt and trousers on as he lay down on the other bed. "Good night, Margaret." "Good night, Tom." Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Margaret. She was acutely conscious of Thomas's presence just a few feet away, his breathing steady in the darkness. She thought of how different her life had become in just 2 days, how this man, a stranger before yesterday, now seemed more real and substantial to her than any of the suitors she'd known in Boston. "Tom," she whispered, unsure if he was still awake. "Yes." His voice came immediately, suggesting he'd been as sleepless as she. "I never properly thanked you for saving my life." There was a rustle as he shifted in his bed. "You don't need to thank me. Any decent man would have done the same." "Perhaps," Margaret conceded. "But not every man would have shown such consideration afterward. You've been kind in ways that go beyond obligation." Silence stretched between them for several heartbeats. "It's easy to be kind to you, Margaret," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion he seemed unwilling to name. The simple honesty of his words warmed her more than any flowery declaration could have. "I'm glad it was you who found me, Tom Grayson." She heard him exhale slowly. "So am I, Margaret Thornton. So am I." They fell silent after that, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was ready to voice fully. Margaret drifted to sleep with the comforting awareness of his presence nearby, no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring. The journey to Santa Fe the following day seemed both too long and too brief. They rode in comfortable companionship, the ease between them growing with each mile. Margaret found herself memorizing details about Thomas, the way sunlight caught in his hair, revealing strands of gold among the brown, the precise shape of his hands on the reins, the cadence of his voice as he pointed out landmarks. As they crested a rise in late afternoon and Santa Fe spread before them, Margaret felt a curious reluctance. Soon she would be with her cousin, resuming the life she had planned before Bandits and a storm and Thomas Grayson had intervened. "Your cousin's mercantile is on the plaza," Thomas said as they rode into town. "We'll be there in a few minutes." Margaret nodded, suddenly uncertain of what to say. "Tom, what will you do after you've delivered me safely?" He was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Head back to my cabin, I suppose. Winter's coming. Need to prepare for trapping season." "I see." She tried to mask her disappointment. What had she expected? That he would stay? That these few days of connection meant as much to him as they did to her? The plaza was busy with activity as they arrived, merchants closing up shops, townspeople hurrying home for supper, children playing in the last light of day. Thomas guided Thunder to a two-story building with a painted sign reading Turner's Mercantile. A woman emerged from the doorway as they dismounted, her expression transforming from curiosity to relief as she recognized Margaret. "Margaret." "Oh, thank God." Emily Turner rushed forward, embracing her cousin tightly. "We've been frantic since hearing about the stage robbery." "How did you?" She pulled back, noticing Thomas for the first time. "Who is this?" "Emily, this is Thomas Grayson," Margaret introduced him. "He saved my life after the bandits left me tied to a tree during the storm." Emily's eyes widened. "Tied to a tree? Oh, Margaret." She turned to Thomas, clasping his hand gratefully. "Mr. Grayson, we are forever in your debt. Please, you must come inside. My husband will want to thank you properly." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "No need for thanks, madam. Just did what needed doing." Despite his protests, Emily insisted, and soon Thomas found himself seated in the Turners' comfortable living quarters above the store, telling a condensed version of the rescue to Emily and her husband James. Margaret watched him, noting how he minimized his own role in the story and spoke with genuine concern about the bandits still at large. "You must stay for supper at least," James Turner insisted when the tale was finished. "And we insist on compensating you for your trouble." Thomas shook his head firmly. "No compensation needed, Mr. Turner, though I'll accept the supper if it's no trouble." During the meal, Margaret observed the easy way Thomas conversed with her relatives, his natural dignity and straightforward manner clearly impressing James. Yet she could sense his growing restlessness, like a wild creature too long confined. As the meal concluded, Thomas stood. "I should be going. Want to make a few miles before dark." "Surely you could stay the night," Emily protested. "We have a spare room." "Thank you, madam, but I've imposed enough," Thomas said politely but firmly. "I need to be getting back." Margaret felt a pang at his words, though she'd expected nothing different. Emily, perceptive as always, glanced between them before nodding. "Margaret, why don't you see Mr. Grayson out while I clear the table?" Grateful for her cousin's tact, Margaret led Thomas downstairs and out to where Thunder waited patiently. The evening air was cool, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "So," Thomas said, adjusting Thunder's saddle straps unnecessarily. "So," Margaret echoed, suddenly finding it difficult to meet his eyes. "Your cousin seems nice. You'll be comfortable here," Margaret nodded. "Yes, Emily has always been kind." An awkward silence fell between them, so different from the easy companionship they'd shared on the trail. Thomas cleared his throat. "Well, I should be going. Of course." Margaret looked up at him finally, finding his blue-gray eyes intent on her face. "Tom, it's all right," he interrupted gently. "No need for speeches. I'm glad you're safe with your family now." He moved to Mount Thunder, and Margaret felt panic rise in her chest. Was this truly how it would end? A polite farewell after all they'd shared. "Will you write?" she blurted out. "Or visit Santa Fe sometimes?" Thomas paused, one foot in the stirrup. He turned back to her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Is that what you want, Margaret, for me to write? To visit?" "Yes," she said simply, summoning all her courage. I think we have more to say to each other than goodbye." Thomas stepped away from his horse, moving closer until he stood directly before her. "I'm not a man of fine words or fancy manners. I live simply, and I haven't much to offer a lady like you." "I don't want fine words or fancy manners," Margaret replied, her heart pounding. "I want honesty and kindness and someone who sees me clearly." "I see you," Thomas said softly. "From the moment I found you in that storm, I've seen nothing else." He reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished, and touched her cheek with a gentleness that made her eyes sting with tears. "I know it's too soon," he continued. "We've known each other just days, but if you're willing, I'd like to court you properly. Visit Santa Fe when I can. Right when I can't. See if what I think we both feel has the strength to grow into something lasting." Margaret covered his hand with her own, holding it against her cheek. "I'd like that very much, Tom Grayson." His smile transformed his face, erasing years of solitude in an instant. "Then that's what we'll do." When he bent to kiss her, it was as gentle as the first raindrops of a summer storm, filled with promise and possibility. Margaret leaned into him, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Thomas Grayson returned to Santa Fe every few weeks that winter, each visit longer than the last. By spring, when the desert bloomed with unexpected wildflowers, he proposed properly, not with flowery declarations, but with simple, heartfelt words that meant more to Margaret than all the poetry in Boston. They were married in the small church on the plaza, with Emily and James as witnesses, and Mrs. Jenkins making the journey from her roadhouse to attend. Thomas built an addition to his cabin, making room for Margaret's books, and the piano James helped transport from Santa Fe as a wedding gift. Years later, when their children asked how they met, Thomas would always begin the story the same way. "I was riding through the worst storm I'd ever seen when I spotted something that didn't belong your mother, tied to a tree by bandits, fighting harder than anyone I'd ever known." And Margaret would always finish it. "And then your father rode through that storm and pulled me to safety. He's been keeping me safe ever since."